introduce our speaker. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. A.J. Reisinger. A.J. is a friend and colleague. He's an assistant professor and the state extension specialist for urban soil and water quality in the Department of Soil, Water, and Ecosystem Sciences at the University of Florida. He's an urban ecosystem ecologist and biogeochemist, focused on how human activities on the landscape affect export of pollutants to aquatic ecosystems and how these aquatic ecosystems respond to those pollutants. In particular, AJ focuses on nitrogen and phosphorus cycling, as well as the effects of pharmaceutical and personal care products in aquatic ecosystems. AJ received his bachelor's degree from the University of Notre Dame in environmental sciences. He has a master's in biology from K-State, and he went back to Notre Dame for his PhD in biology. He's been here at UF since 2017, where his current extension and research appointment focuses on biogeochemical dynamics in urban watersheds, including the effects of residential landscape management on nutrient leaching and runoff, nutrient cycling and algal dynamics in stormwater ponds, and nutrient and energy dynamics of urban streams. So thank you very much for being with us, and I will turn it over to AJ for his presentation.
Awesome. Thanks for the introduction, Laura. Thanks to Laura and Savannah for inviting me. And thank you all for being here. Let me share my screen and get my presentation up and running here. So hopefully you all are seeing my screen. I'm just going to hide my meeting controls real quick and hide everyone's faces. All right. So, like Laura said, my name is A.J. Reisinger. I'm an assistant professor, urban soil and water quality specialist here at the University of Florida, based out of Gainesville. I'm trained as a stream and river biogeochemist, ecosystem ecologist, really interested in nutrients and energy dynamics in aquatic environments. But when I came here to Florida, I realized that one of the major aquatic ecosystems in the landscape, particularly in urban landscapes, are these stormwater ponds. So I'm going to talk to you today about what we've done, what we're doing, and what we're going to do, looking at how stormwater ponds are functioning and how we can improve their management to enhance their benefits for society. So, okay, now I should advance. There we go. Before we get started, I'd like to just acknowledge some folks that have actually done most of this research, particularly lab members Audrey Geckner and Steve Homan, who did a lot of this work for Audrey for her PhD dissertation, Steve for his master's thesis, and then 3 really great undergraduate students who have contributed a lot to this. Also, a ton of UF collaborators. I'm not going to list all of them, as well as funding sources. So this work has been funded by the National Science Foundation, Florida Department of Environmental Protection, IFAS, Center for Land Use Efficiency, and the Water Institute. Before we dig into the specifics of the research, I want to just kind of set the stage on why we care about urban water quality, urbanization in general. One of the main reasons is because urbanization is one of, if not the major drivers of land use change and a global agent of environmental change. So here in Florida, we have a highly urban area, but Florida is not unique, right? If you look on the right, you can see the population of the globe from 1500 to 2016. You can see around 1800, it starts to increase exponentially. That's the 1800s is when you're having like the Industrial Revolution and that sort of thing. And it really starts to go crazy in the 1940s, 1950s, when the agricultural revolution occurred. And this agricultural revolution, coupled with the Industrial Revolution, led to a shift in the population centers of our society, people moving from agricultural areas and small family farms into cities where the jobs are, and farming is now done at a more larger industrial corporate scale rather than small family farm scale. So that has led to people moving to cities, and where people are, we tend to have various impacts on the environment. This is particularly true here in Florida, where we are already a highly urban society, highly urban state, and it's going to get increasingly urbanized. So these images are maps from the Florida 2070 project. I imagine many of you are familiar with this work. But on the left here, we see the Florida land use in 2010, when the state had about 18 million residents. In red are all the developed areas in the state of Florida. The dark green are protected areas like the Everglades or like various national forests or state parks. And then in light green is everything else. That includes agricultural areas, it includes unincorporated rural areas, it includes barren lands, that sort of thing. The Florida 2070 project then looked at projections for population growth as well as land use demands from that population, and projects that by 2070, the state of Florida should have about 34 million people. And those people need somewhere to live. And so in order to house that additional 16 million people, we're going to have almost a doubling of the developed landscape here in the state. If we follow the current trajectory for land use demands at a population scale, basically all of peninsular Florida will become developed or protected as a state or national park or something like that. So there is still some pockets that are undeveloped around Lake O, for example, but in general, the vast majority of the state is projected to become a large development for generally speaking. And one of the things that we have to be concerned about with our environmental impacts during this development process is managing stormwater. So urbanization has a wide range of impacts, but stormwater runoff and alterations to stormwater runoff are one of the major issues associated with urbanization. Altered stormwater runoff is one of, if not the oldest human impacts on the water cycle. One of the first human impacts on the environment in general. So the first time that somebody took a leaf or a branch or a rock and put it over their head because they didn't want to get rained on and they wanted somewhere dry to sleep, that was the first time we were manipulating the water cycle and changing how water runs off the landscape. And we've continued to manage the water cycle to our desires. We move water where we want it to be and we put it away from where we don't want it to be. Increasing urbanization is known to lead to a variety of impacts on the hydrologic cycle, including flashier hydrographs and streams. This means that streams will have a lower base flow level, but they will respond much more rapidly to small rainfall events. So a really small rainfall event can cause a large flooding event if there's a lot of urbanization in the watershed, because that rainwater naturally might slowly percolate and infiltrate into groundwater and make its way through groundwater flow paths into the stream. But after you pave the entire watershed, that small amount of rain will basically immediately route down into the stream channel, and it's basically a wall of water that makes its way into the streams, causing these flashy hydrographs. Along with this increased stormwater runoff, you have increased pollutant loading associated with the different chemicals we use on the landscape that then get washed downstream during this runoff event. And finally, we have altered connectivity by, for example, paving over certain streams and rivers, or draining wetlands, or artificially manipulating where we have ponds and lakes, and really controlling where that water goes. And that shifts how aquatic organisms can move across the landscape as well. Stormwater ponds are one of the most common, if not the most common practices to reduce the downstream impacts of urbanization. They're primarily designed for flood control. So stormwater ponds are built, constructed, and managed in order to capture a certain volume of stormwater runoff and to slowly release that water downstream, reducing that flashiness of the hydrograph. However, they're also assumed to provide pollutant removal benefits as well, including things like removing nutrients and sediments. In a survey that's about 15 years old now, there's a survey of stormwater engineers across the United States, and they asked what strategies, what tools are used to reduce nitrogen export in your urban watersheds. And stormwater wet ponds, these are permanently wet ponds, what you'd think about for a normal pond, were the most frequently mentioned and the highest ranked as the most important tool in the stormwater engineer toolbox. So these stormwater ponds are everywhere. They're used across the country, but they're particularly used here in the state of Florida. We published a paper a few years ago where we did a geospatial analysis investigation to map out all the stormwater ponds throughout the state of Florida. And that map is what you see here on the left. All of the blue dots, and yes, these are individual blue dots, not big giant blue blobs. Each individual blue dot is a single stormwater pond in the state of Florida. We estimate that there's at least 76,000 urban stormwater ponds in the state, and they account for more of the state's surface area land use than industrial land uses in the state. So it's kind of crazy to me to think that there's almost as many stormwater ponds, or almost as much stormwater pond coverage as recreational lands or institutional lands at a state level. So they're a very important tool in the toolbox, and they're also a highly common, ubiquitous component of our urban landscape here in Florida. Within stormwater ponds, even though they are these artificial engineered aquatic ecosystems, that doesn't mean that they're sterile. They still have a wide range of natural, biological, and chemical processes that are occurring within these ponds. I'm particularly going to be talking about nitrogen cycling today, so I wanted to just give a quick overview on a few things that are happening in the nitrogen cycle. One thing that happens is nitrogen fixation. Nitrogen fixation is the production of inorganic nitrogen from nitrogen gas. So the atmosphere is about 70 to 80% nitrogen gas, and that nitrogen gas can be converted into organic nitrogen forms in water bodies or in terrestrial environments. And so this represents a novel input of nitrogen into the environment. And so it's actually adding nitrogen pollution into the reactive biosphere. So it's a negative, a net impact for water quality. Denitrification is kind of the counter to this process of N fixation. Denitrification represents the conversion or removal of inorganic nitrogen and converting it into N2 gas. So this is denitrification right here. And it represents a permanent removal of nitrogen from the reactive biosphere and converting it into atmospheric nitrogen gas. Finally, there's assimilation or uptake. So assimilation or uptake are when organisms convert inorganic nitrogen into their biomass. So every living thing needs nitrogen to grow and to live and to survive. And so they have to get that nitrogen from somewhere. So they take it from the environment and they incorporate it into their cells, into their tissues. But this process represents a temporary removal of nitrogen from the environment, but eventually these organisms will die and they'll decompose and that nitrogen will be released back into the water. So speaking of assimilatory processes, uptake, and organismal growth, a major process that drives the growth or that represents the growth of organisms in the environment is ecosystem metabolism. So ecosystem metabolism is really the overall energy dynamics of an environment, and it's the balance between gross primary production, which is basically photosynthesis, and ecosystem respiration. So if you remember or recall back to your high school biology days, hopefully some of you might remember it better than I do, but primary production or photosynthesis is the conversion of inorganic carbon as CO2 into carbohydrates or organic carbon molecules. This photosynthesis produces oxygen, and it basically is kind of capturing the energy from carbon and storing it in organic form. Then ecosystem respiration breaks these organic bonds of these organic carbon molecules and converts it into inorganic carbon and capitalizes on the energy that's released by breaking these bonds. So this is building or growing of biomass, and this is consuming biomass and using that energy. So you can think of it as the ecosystem inhaling and exhaling, and at the whole ecosystem scale. And we can measure these processes by looking at the change in dissolved oxygen over time. So that's kind of the fundamentals, setting the stage for what we're doing, thinking about stormwater ponds. So we're going to start by first talking about what we've learned about nutrient and energy cycling in stormwater ponds. So this is work that's been published or that's been established over the last few years in our group. And this has been led by Steve Homan, like I mentioned, and Audrey Geckner. And then I'm going to talk a lot about what we're learning currently about stormwater ponds. Audrey is close to the finishing stages of her dissertation, and she's got some really cool results. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what she's been doing. And then I'm going to tell you about what we're planning for stormwater ponds. So this is an NSF-funded project that we just got started, that we're still looking for additional partners and interested parties to help us on this project. So if you have any interest, please feel free to reach out after the seminar. So let's get started. What we've learned. What do we know about nutrient and energy cycling? So like I mentioned earlier, stormwater ponds are primarily designed and built to protect downstream ecosystems from flooding. So they're supposed to capture a certain volume or quantity of water, but they are also expected to provide water quality benefits as well. In state regulatory language, there are expectations that stormwater ponds will remove at least 80% of the nitrogen and phosphorus that comes into the system. So from an inflow-outflow mass balance perspective, stormwater ponds are expected to remove about 80% of the pollutants that enter them. So we know that ponds are good at removing sediment and phosphorus. So this is a figure from the Stormwater Bible in the state of Florida, the Harper and Baker 2007 FDEP report. And they looked at the removal efficiency as calculated as outflow relative to inflow phosphorus concentrations or phosphorus masses. And they calculated these removal efficiencies for about 25 stormwater ponds, ranging in water detention, water holding times from 0 to almost 500 days. And they found that holding onto the water for about a week gives you a really big benefit. And then if you hold onto the water for another few months, you can get up to that 80% threshold that's talked about in regulatory language. So that's pretty good. Phosphorus is removed by stormwater ponds. It's stored, it's sequestered. However, we know that ponds are not very good at removing nitrogen. So this is the same study looking at the same 25 or so ponds. And you can see that instead of getting up to the 80% threshold, you do still see this spike in nitrogen removal efficiency in the first couple of weeks, but it never really gets past about 45 to 50% nitrogen removal efficiency. So we know that ponds aren't as good as we think they should be, and we actually expect them to be based on our watershed nitrogen budgets. So we want to know, why aren't these ponds as good at removing nitrogen as we think they should be? So all of these data from the Harper and Baker Bible are based on inflow, outflow, mass balances. They kind of treat a pond like a black box. They don't have any information about what processes are occurring within ponds. So that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to open up that black box, and we're doing that through a variety of processes. What Steve did is what's called a flow-through core or continuous flow incubation approach, where he collected these sediment cores from 16 different ponds in Gainesville and in Miami. And then he slowly ran water from those sites through the sediment cores and measured the changes in dissolved gases and nutrient concentrations between the inflow and outflow of the sediment core. So you can see how the water chemistry is changing as it's exposed to these sediments. And that can tell you something about the various biological or biogeochemical processes. So Steve was measuring the net nitrogen gas flux in these sediment core incubations. A positive nitrogen gas flux is denitrification. So if you think back to the beginning, I said denitrification is the removal of nitrogen from the environment, so it's a benefit for water quality. A negative N2 flux is N fixation. That means that ponds are producing nitrogen gas, and that's a negative for the environment. It's bad for water quality. So under ambient conditions in two regions, in Gainesville, which is shown in blue, and Miami, which is shown in orange, 2 seasons with the dry season in triangles, the wet season in circles. When we're just exposing these sediments to site water, pretty flat lines, not a lot going on across these 16 different stormwater ponds, ranging from 10 to 35 years old. So, okay, ponds aren't really doing much at all, but we also noted that there wasn't a lot of nitrogen in the water to begin with. So we wanted to simulate a stormwater runoff event. And so we added nitrates into the tanks here at the beginning to simulate what would happen during a stormwater runoff event. And we found that after you simulate that stormwater runoff, you get an increase in net denitrification rates across all of the stormwater ponds. Well, all but one actually decreased slightly. And you see that this increase is really substantial, particularly in older ponds in Gainesville. So why Gainesville versus Miami? Well, Gainesville ponds look something like this. The ponds that we sampled in Gainesville were a lot more naturally managed, had a lot more vegetation along the littoral shelves, as well as submerged aquatic vegetation. The sediments were a lot more organic rich, whereas Miami ponds were a lot more manicured, had turf grass banks mowed up to the edge. The sediments were pretty much pure sand. They appeared to have been maybe dredged more recently. There wasn't a lot of aquatic vegetation. So we think that what's happening here is that as ponds age and they're allowed to naturally develop, naturally establish aquatic plant communities, they contribute additional carbon and maybe microbial communities to enhance denitrification. And that's not evident in Miami ponds that are more manicured for aesthetics. We also know, though, that ponds are sources of carbon to the atmosphere. So ponds can bury carbon at pretty high rates. This is work that was done by Audrey Geckner in the Lakewood Ranch region in Bradenton, Florida. And looking at this figure from her paper, Sediment burial, this is sediment burial of carbon is shown here in red. And these rates of sediment burial, they don't seem like much because they're compared to her blue dots here. But these sediment carbon burial rates are equivalent to really high rates found in tropical reservoirs, for example. She also found, though, that carbon gas export decreases with pond age. So younger ponds emit a lot of carbon. That's as both CO2 and CH4. And so when you add those two together, carbon emissions in blue, carbon storage in red, or in brown, I don't know, like pale red, the overall net source sink dynamics of these ponds is that as ponds age, they become closer to being net sinks, so storing carbon, but younger ponds up to about 20 years appear to be emitting a lot of carbon to the atmosphere. And so that's a negative for greenhouse gas emissions and climate change perspective. So to summarize what we've learned about nutrient and energy cycling in stormwater ponds, we know that they're everywhere, especially in Florida. We know that they can do a lot of different things. I didn't talk about all of this, but we have evidence that they're beneficial for aesthetics and property values. They provide benefits for flood control. They actually can enhance biodiversity in aquatic environments. But we also know they aren't great at some things. They aren't great at nitrogen removal because they have nitrogen fixation occurring, or they don't have denitrification to the same rate as we might think. And they can sequester carbon. But the management of these ponds and the age of these ponds matter, particularly when we're thinking about like Miami versus Gainesville ponds. And I should note, Miami versus Gainesville isn't a management concern. It's just, it happens to be that the ponds we sampled in Miami were more manicured, and the ponds we sampled in Gainesville were more naturalized. That doesn't mean that all ponds in Gainesville are natural and all ponds in Miami are aesthetically manicured. So looking now, what are we currently learning? What are we doing right now thinking about stormwater ponds? Well, we're trying to dig in a little bit more about what's happening within the ponds. And we're also wanting to look more about what's happening downstream of the ponds, because that's what ponds are actually built for, to protect downstream, not to be functional themselves. Or not to be natural themselves, I guess I should say. So Audrey is working on a study where she sampled 21 ponds in the dry season, and an additional followed up with 10 ponds, subsampling of these 21 ponds in the wet season of 2021. And she sampled 15 urban stormwater ponds from the Lakewood Ranch region, which is shown down here. There's over 400 stormwater ponds in this master plan community, and she picked 15 of them. And she compared those 15 stormwater ponds to 6 undisturbed natural ponds and small lakes at the Ordway-Swisher Biological Station, which is near Melrose, Florida, about an hour east of Gainesville. And these 6 ponds included 3 clear water sites and 3 humic water sites. So at these 21 ponds, she went out and she conducted some fairly straightforward limnological surveying, where she characterized the thermal profiles of ponds. So she measured temperature as it increases with depth. And what happens in ponds is you get to a certain depth, you get this rapid threshold change in water temperature, and that's based on lake physics. And so once she identified where these different sections of the ponds were at what depths, she collected water samples from the surface, middle, and bottom depths. From these water samples, she did various different water quality measurements, but what we're going to talk about today is she looked at dissolved gas saturation and dissolved nitrogen gas in particular. She measured dissolved nitrogen gas using membrane inlet mass spectrometry and calculated the N2 saturation ratio. What this N2 saturation ratio is it's how much N2 gas is dissolved in the water that she actually measured versus how much should be there based just on physics. Based on like physical gas principles, we can calculate how much dissolved gas there should be in a water body if we know the temperature, pressure, and salinity of that water. However, there are biological and chemical processes that can produce or consume dissolved gas beyond those physical constraints. And so that's what we're trying to assess through this N2 saturation ratio. If the N2 saturation ratio is higher than 1, so if there's more gas dissolved in the water than we would expect based on physics, that means that there's nitrogen gas being produced by the pond, and that suggests net denitrification. So that's a positive for water quality again. If that N2 ratio is less than 1, that means that there's less dissolved nitrogen gas in the water than we would expect. It means something's consuming that dissolved nitrogen gas, and that's the process of nitrogen fixation, which means that these ponds are actually a source of nitrogen themselves, in addition to what's coming in from upstream into the ponds. So jumping right into the results, this is just looking at that N2 saturation ratio. So this is 1.00. This red line would represent no production or consumption. Everything to the left of this line indicates net N fixation. So this is a negative for water quality. Anything to the right of the line indicates net denitrification. The pond or the lake is removing nitrogen from the environment. And you can see across the 93 dissolved gas samples that Audrey analyzed from her 21 ponds and 3 different depths and multiple seasons, et cetera, about 60% were net denitrifying and about 40% were net nitrogen fixing. So more we're having benefits for water quality than we're being impacting water quality. So that's good. You might want to see a little bit more denitrification if you're managing these ponds and expecting nitrogen removal, but 60 is better than 40. However, when we separate this between natural sites and urban sites, we see that 82% of the natural sites, shown here in green, were indicating net denitrification. So denitrification was a lot more common, was by far the majority of the samples analyzed from natural water bodies. Our urban stormwater ponds, however, were split right down the middle. 50% were indicating net nitrogen fixation, 50% were indicating net denitrification. So some stormwater ponds can be benefits for water quality, but it's a lot more common for these systems to actually be sources of nitrogen and negatively impacting downstream water quality from this result. But that's, again, just looking at what's happening in the ponds themselves. We don't necessarily manage ponds to be beautiful, pristine environments themselves. They're tools for us on the landscape to protect our downstream water bodies. And so Audrey's following up on this work to look at the downstream effects of ponds. And this is based on the idea of a framework that we have in stream and river ecology called the river continuum concept. The idea here is that as streams increase in size, there's a shift in the energy inputs. So headwater streams are typically driven by inputs of terrestrial organic matter, like leaves falling into the stream. There's a lot of shading. There's not a lot of open canopy, so there can't be a lot of primary production by algae within the streams themselves. However, as you move into larger and larger river systems, the streams widen. You get more light hitting the stream or river directly and less influence of the surrounding riparian canopy. And so that suggests that larger rivers become driven by internal inputs, and also larger rivers are deeper and more likely to support a free-living planktonic community. So some people have kind of termed this that large rivers almost become flowing lakes rather than big streams. But we also know that urbanization alters the internal and external drivers of energy and nutrient cycling. So urbanization, you chop down a lot of the trees along the riparian zone, and you have these engineered connections between stormwater ponds and the streams themselves. So what Audrey and the rest of us are trying to figure out is, how does urbanization change the patterns that we expect to see with energy and nutrient cycling along this river continuum or this stream size gradient? And so, yeah, so how do ponds influence this dynamic, and how do ponds affect the natural water bodies that they are expected or projected or designed to protect? And so for this work, Audrey is, again, we're getting very familiar with Lakewood Ranch. Lakewood Ranch has been a great partner in a lot of our stormwater pond research. And she's doing this pond-river interactions project, focusing primarily on the Braden River. The Braden River is great because it flows from a fairly natural / agricultural rural community through some golf courses, et cetera. But then it gets into this highly urbanized, highly stormwater managed environment. So you can see here the Braden River is highlighted in this yellow flow path, flowing from right to left. And along the Braden River, Audrey established 4 stream sampling sites, shown here in the light blue pins on this Google map. And then she also established 3 pond sampling sites that discharge directly into the river. So those are shown in these purple points. So they all have direct connections to the Braden River. At each of these 7 sites, she deployed dissolved oxygen sensors and also collected various water chemistry samples on different sampling trips. The dissolved oxygen sensors allow us to estimate whole ecosystem metabolism by looking at the changes in dissolved oxygen concentrations over 24-hour periods. So if you remember back to gross primary production and respiration, you have photosynthesis driving a lot of that, and that's triggered by daylight and by sunshine. And so that lets us look at it over a 24-hour period. Audrey also characterized water chemistry at all of these sites, a few nitrogen cycling rates like denitrification and nitrogen fixation, and she measured the microbial community composition of the planktonic or the water column communities at all of these sites to see if these streams and rivers, as you move into larger and larger systems, do indeed become more pond-like and start to look more like the stormwater ponds nearby. So I'm just going to jump into the results here. I'm really glossing over a lot of the methods, a lot of the details. I'm happy to talk more about it. But this is a crazy busy graph, but I think it's a really, really cool graph. And I don't know if I can really portray how exciting these results are. But looking here, we have gross primary production on the top figure as a production of oxygen. So this is photosynthesis, basically. And then at the bottom, we have ecosystem respiration. This is the consumption of organic material for energy. So this is sort of autotrophic plants and algae photosynthesizing, and this is everything. This is bacteria and algae and bugs and fish, everything breathing. Looking at these figures, the blue colors are our pond sites, and the orange and red and brownish colors are our stream sites. We are looking at weekly averaged metabolic rates for gross primary production and respiration from March of 2021 through March of 2022. I believe, or it might be 2022 to 2023. Yeah, it's 2022 to 2023. And then on the right here, these box plots represent the period of record or all of the data from here is thrown into a box plot here with the median shown as the bars and then the 25th through 75th percentiles as the whiskers here, or 5th and 95th, actually, I think. The cool thing about this is we see that the ponds have much higher rates of gross primary production than the stream sites. So that's not too surprising because there's a lot more light hitting ponds than streams. But moving from left to right in the streams, we're going from the headwaters downstream through the increasing urbanization along this river continuum. So we see that the streams become more and more productive and more similar to ponds with their metabolic activity, both from gross primary production and from respiration perspectives. So that tells us that these metabolic data do suggest that streams become more pond-like as they become exposed to more stormwater pond effluent. We do also see some differences seasonally. We see one pond in particular really kind of crashed for gross primary production. And then all of the ponds had some impacts in November when we had major storm events that you might recall last November. And I think I hit all of the main points here. So this is really exciting to me. And also I want to point out that these are the first data ever collected from stormwater ponds for for pond metabolism. So this is really exciting work that Audrey's looking to get published soon. And to give you an idea of where this information sits in the broader field, this is more of an academic interest of mine, but this figure we show here on the left is from a synthesis of all aquatic metabolism studies that had been conducted as of 2013. So the data are a little dated, but you can see that these various clouds are all of the stream metabolism data. We're following in this cloud of ecosystem respiration and gross primary production. All of the lakes were along this one-to-one line. Wetlands and ponds were pretty well constrained in here, and estuaries also fall along this one-to-one line. You see a lot of things fall below the one-to-one line, not a lot up above. If we look at Audrey's continuous record of pond and stream metabolism from the Braden River study, blue and the orange-red are again ponds and streams. So you can see there's a wide spread. There's a lot of variability across the entire year across all of these study sites. I can't really take a lot away from this noisy plot directly by itself, but when we add on the wetlands and ponds kind of polygon from this synthesis study, you can see that Audrey's ponds fall way outside of or way beyond the wetlands and ponds that had been studied as of 2013. So this tells us that stormwater ponds are much more metabolically variable and likely more productive than a natural pond or wetland would be. We also know that nitrogen cycling is going to vary seasonally from Audrey's work. So I'm not going to spend too much time on this because we've talked a lot about the nitrogen saturation ratio already. But positive values, denitrification, negative values, and fixation. So during the dry season, the three ponds were kind of variable. Two of them were end fixing, one was denitrifying. And the streams were kind of in the same boat. There's some fixation, some denitrification, not a lot of strong patterns. But during the wet season, we see that the streams pretty much all shift to this denitrification perspective. And you do kind of see that moving from left to right here, we're increasing our urbanization. So there does seem to be a general trend of this increasing along the streams as well. Ponds, again, are kind of variable. During the following dry season, we see ponds might be end fix or might be denitrifying more likely, but streams switch back to net end fixation. So there does seem to be this seasonal pattern driven by the wet or dry seasons that is expressing itself in the N2 saturation ratio. And why might that be? Well, it could be due to inputs of nitrogen. It could be due to hypoxia. But we're really interested in whether or not it's due to shifts in the community composition, because during the dry season, stormwater ponds are separated from the stream. You don't have a lot of rains that causes stormwater ponds to discharge directly into the streams and rivers. And so they're, in all intents and purposes, two completely separate communities. But then during the wet season, when it rains and the ponds fill up and overflow, they're more frequently connected and more frequently discharging and exporting their communities to the river. And so Audrey looked at the microbial communities to see if we have evidence for that hydrological process impacting the biological communities. So during the dry season, which is shown here in April of 2022, on the left, we are looking at the 3 pond microbial communities. This is an ordination plot. I don't want to really get into the nitty gritty of what it's showing, but you can think of it as each point represents one sample taken from the relevant sites. And the points are the microbial diversity, microbial community from that sample. So if 3 points are really close together, it's a really consistent community. If 3 points are really far apart, then it's a more variable community within that site. And the closer that sites are to each other, the more similar they are to each other. So these ovals represent the clustering of ponds compared to streams. So you can see that the streams and the ponds do appear to have separate, distinct microbial communities. Each site appears to be distinct, but as you increase your urbanization and you move downstream, the most downstream, most stormwater pond exposed site is the most similar to our stormwater pond sites. During the wet season, however, we see that these ponds and streams, the microbial communities start to overlap. So you see ponds here are in blue, stream communities are in the oranges again, and there's much more overlap between these two ovals. And there's a lot less distinct trends or trajectories along that stream land use gradient. So this suggests that the wet season rains that are connecting stormwater ponds and streams are really connecting the microbial communities and the biological communities as well. And finally, we went back in the dry season of 2023 to follow up again to see if we could repeat that process. And we again see a fairly similar process. We see that the ponds are somewhat distinct from the stream communities, but the largest stream, the most downstream site, is more similar to ponds than to upstream sites. So this is really cool. I know it's complex and complicated stuff for if you don't think in microbial community perspectives, microbial ecology or community ecology perspectives, but this is showing that ponds are fundamentally affecting and influencing their downstream environments in maybe positive or maybe negative ways. But this is, to our knowledge, the first study that's shown this impact of ponds on downstream environments directly. So to summarize what we're learning about ponds, they are often sources of nitrogen, not sinks, and they are distinct biogeochemically, although functionally and the community dynamics do become more similar during the wet season. And then just to wrap up, I want to talk a little bit about this project that we're just getting started, looking at stormwater ponds across the state. So this NSF-funded project is the People and Ponds project. This cartoon schematic is a really coarse view of what we're trying to do. We're trying to look at how various levels of society, regulatory, community, and individual household levels perceive ponds and stormwater pond functioning, and how those perceptions lead to their expectations of ponds, how those expectations change management of those ponds, and then how those management practices influence the ultimate state of the ponds or the ecosystem services provided by ponds. We want to know if these ecosystem services match our societal values and expectations that could kind of lead to a continued management from the same approach. Or if our management approach leads to an algal bloom, but we don't like algal blooms, then we'll go back to the drawing board and say, okay, we need to change our management perspectives or change our expectations. And so the kind of hypothesis is that individual and community levels expect clear blue ponds that look really nice, whereas regulatory perspectives might expect greener ponds that might have more biogeochemical benefits for downstream environments. And so we're working on this through a variety of different perspectives. Paul Monahan in Ag Education and Communications is leading up social experiments and social surveys, quantifying how different parts of society value stormwater ponds, and incorporating educational and social marketing practices to see if that will affect our values. Ultimately, we want to get to the point where we can identify optimal combinations of various ecosystem services and ecosystem functions provided by ponds so that we can manage them to best benefit all aspects of society. We also want to look at the ponds themselves. So we're measuring and monitoring 20 stormwater ponds within 2 focal communities, quantifying nitrogen and carbon cycling, microbial community dynamics, measuring algal blooms and toxin production. A lot of this is being led by Dale Laughinghouse and myself. We're going to do a limnocorral study where we use different algal control methods like copper sulfate or hydrogen peroxide to kill algae and see what that does for water quality impacts and nutrient cycling. And finally, we're going to use remote sensing as well as a statewide survey to establish stormwater pond water quality across the entire state in as many ponds as we possibly can by coupling a broad summer survey with ongoing lake watch monitoring and satellite imagery being led by Sam Schmidt. Finally, we're going to link people and ponds by assessing what people value, looking at their stated preferences through a discrete choice survey where we ask people what they're willing to pay for various pond functions. How much would you be willing to pay to move a pond from having this bright green watercolor to this really clear watercolor? How much are you willing to pay to remove an extra pound of nitrogen per year and prevent that from making its way to the coast? We're going to ask people what they say they value. And then we're also going to use real estate transactions to see what people actually value, where they put their money, by seeing how property values change in relation to stormwater pond proximity, as well as stormwater pond quality. So this will let us ask what people show they value. And so for this project, we just got it started in, well, not just now, it's a few months old now. We started it in May of 2023. We're currently finalizing our focal communities and our sites that we're going to be monitoring. We are ordering materials, getting all up and running. And starting in January, we're going to start our monthly monitoring of ponds. We're already have ongoing social surveys and focus groups and those willingness to pay surveys. Our second year will include more monitoring, will include our statewide surveys and our remote sensing and our economic real estate analyses. And finally, in 2026 and 2027, we'll finish data processing and report our results, both in scientific publications, as well as working with local communities and HOAs to identify ways to enhance the management of these ponds to improve their benefits for their communities. So if you're interested in this project, feel free to reach out. We're continuing to look for partners. We do have some focal communities already identified, but we're always looking for additional ponds for our statewide survey or backup communities. Also, if you're a pond manager or no pond managers, we'd love additional partners that can give their perspective and their identities for what issues they might be seeing in their ponds that they manage. And so with that, I think I probably used more time than I was even allotted. So I will stop right there and open it up for questions. Let me stop sharing my screen. Thank you, everybody, for coming also.
Thank you, AJ. That was a great seminar and a good background on stormwater ponds. If anyone has questions, feel free to unmute yourselves and ask those questions. You can also type them into the chat and we will read them out that way. If people are thinking about them and getting ready, I can ask first. You talked a little bit about how the goal of stormwater ponds is really flood management, and that maybe a bonus, an expected bonus, is nitrogen or phosphorus removal. Is there any but we can manage and make that nitrogen removal better. Are there any trade-offs between those two functions of flood control and nutrient retention?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. And first off, I'll say, yes, I did say that. That's an oversimplification for sure. Sometimes stormwater ponds are built and designed for flood control. We have treatment wetlands that are for nutrient control, water quality benefits. But the kind of paradigm is water quantity is first and foremost, because it's more hazard related, and like you could have really extreme floods that are problematic. There are trade-offs, I think, because a lot of the benefits that we get from natural ecological processes to remove nutrients are fundamentally driven by connecting the water with the sediments. Sediments are where a lot of the biogeochemical cycling occurs in aquatic environments, because that's where you have organic matter settling, you have low oxygen or variable redox conditions, that sort of thing. And so the systems that I, at least, and most people usually think of as being the most biogeochemically active are often shallower systems that have higher surface area to water volume ratios. And so more contact between the water and the sediments. And that's kind of counterintuitive to wanting to have a really large volume for storing your water quantity. So if you think about driving through a community, driving through Gainesville, for example, you'll see a lot of ponds that are just like squares or trapezoids and really deep holes. Those are built just to maximize the volume of water that they can hold, but they're not going to have as much function. Whereas if you wanted to enhance their functioning, you might want to undulate the depths and have more plants, but that also would lead to the ponds filling up more and reducing their volume. And you might have to dredge them more, which then resets the biological process. So yeah, there are reasons why you can't do both perfectly, because they are sometimes opposed. That's a really good point. I hadn't thought of that, though.
We do have some questions coming into the chat. So
Okay.
do you want me to read those out to you, or do you want to read them?
Sure, you can read them. Just
okay.
Because otherwise it's awkward and I'm talking to myself.
Fair enough. A question about Northeast Florida is the use of living shorelines in stormwater ponds. How do you think they could address nitrogen and phosphorus management? Are there examples of modifying the stormwater ponds using living shorelines?
So, hi, Caitlin. Thanks for the question. By living shorelines, I'm going to interpret that as just plants along the banks of stormwater ponds. And that is a pretty common approach that's being pushed and being expected to have benefits for water quality. And there are reasons for that expectation. We do know that increasing plants, particularly along the shoreline, similar to along coastal shorelines, will reduce erosion, will reduce wave action, will prevent loss of sediments, and that's going to have benefits for water quality. But there's also kind of mixed results on how effective those bank plantings are for reducing or improving water quality and nutrient removal. A lot of the water that makes its way into stormwater ponds is piped through subsurface pipes, so it won't even hit those banks other than during really high flow events. And a lot of the literature that we have from natural ponds and natural small lakes suggests that submersed aquatic vegetation, so things that are rooted at the bottom of the ponds, are going to have more benefits for nutrient removal, because they actually get their nutrients from the water rather than from the soil. So there's some reason to believe that those living shorelines would have benefits for water quality. We have actually an ongoing DEP study led by Basil Iannone to address that more quantitatively. But that being said, there's other benefits to the living shorelines approach, like biodiversity and property values. And I mean, keeping turf grass from the edge will also potentially lead to less fertilizer being applied along the shores, that sort of thing. So there's other benefits as well.
I like to hear the shout out for SAV. The next question is from Savannah. Did the increasing trend towards net carbon storage affect you found hold across both naturally managed and manicured managed pond types?
Yeah, it's a good question. So that, unfortunately, those studies are not, they weren't the same studies, and they weren't, the carbon storage, carbon burial work was actually part of Audrey's master's when she was working with another PI. I was on her committee, but so she only has those 5 stormwater ponds that are all, they're not like fully manicured, just turf grass, nothing. They're like have some bank plantings and some trees and such, but they're definitely not a natural pond either. I would, based on Steve's work and the like Gainesville versus Miami comparison, I would expect that that would hold true, at least in the sediment burial information, just based on sediment organic matter. But we don't have the information on emissions rates from those studies, so I can't say for sure.
We have a question from Jenica Henry that says, have there been any local policies that affected your pond project so far? Are there any that you would have to watch out for in the future?
Okay. Sorry, I'm also just seeing Savannah's message to me. Is Laura reading these questions okay with the recording?
Yeah,
Okay, perfect.
thanks.
Good. Yeah. Local policies that have affected our pond project or projects so far. I wouldn't say like local, like regulatory policies at like city, county, or state levels have affected us. Like often if there are local policies, we'd be interested in incorporating that into the study and assessing whether or not that's going to have an impact. The things that affect us more are communities, HOAs, individual pond owners not being willing to let us work in the ponds. Because most ponds are privately owned, privately managed and maintained, and like an HOA or a similar entity is usually responsible for the management. And so there are liability concerns. So we do sometimes have trouble getting access to these ponds. Sometimes we skirt those rules and just kind of go in and out as fast as we can. But when we have to be there for like a 3 or 4 hour study, we need to get permission, and that sometimes can be hard to do. More often than not, though, at least the like regulatory folks that we've talked about, the stormwater engineers or the environmental directors for a county level, are usually really excited for us to do this work because they want to learn more about how to improve pond management.
Awesome. Next question is your study comparing ponds that have littoral zone enhancements added versus ones that have not in your people and pond projects?
Yeah, so the NSF project that we're just getting started is not focused on littoral plantings directly. We are still finalizing our site selection, and that is something that we're probably going to account for. We'll like quantify the plant biomass and submerged and emergent and littoral plant biomass as a covariate, but that's not like the main driver. But like I mentioned earlier, there's another DEP funded 319 funded project that Basil Iannone, who's in fisheries, forest fisheries and geomatic sciences, is leading. And so that one is more directly focused on littoral plantings, both from a environmental and public perception approach.
Great. Another question from Jenica is, when pond data was taken during the dry seasons, did high temperatures alter the data severely?
So I don't think so. We didn't really directly look at temperature so the metabolism data, the continuous like whole year where we have weekly data that we presented, that has temperature kind of incorporated into it because temperature influences oxygen saturation. And so we do account for that already. Temperature would, all things being equal, would be expected to speed up biological rates. And so that would potentially be one reason for seasonal differences. But we haven't looked at that directly, so I can't say 100% for sure one way or the other. Yeah.
And we also just have some kudos on the chats and some suggestions for new pond areas, but we'll make sure AJ gets those.
Yeah.
Are there any other questions for AJ? All right. If not, I think
Cool.
we can finish up a couple minutes early. Thank you so much, AJ, for
Yep.
joining us, and thank you guys all for attending. Again, our next one is in 2 weeks, so we hope to see a bunch of you guys back for that one.
Awesome. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, AJ.